This patch is absolutely bonkers. Ladies and gentlemen, we got him. Professor X has been compromised to a semi-permanent end. So multiple things are happening to this card. First, going to 5/2 removes the synergy with Ravonna Renslayer. Second, now cards will be able to move or switch locations in his lane, meaning a Nihilist stuff is going to actually work against him. Goblins will work against him. But more importantly, Jeff, Nocturne, Vision, all of that stuff will be able to enter his lane. And most importantly, Hela cards still will not. So quick list of things that will work, stuff that moves, stuff that switches, quick list of things that won't, Hela, Doctor Doom, things of that nature. What this does is threefold, actually. First, removing Professor X's synergy with Ravonna is not necessarily the most important thing. It's nice that it happened, though, because then the fact that it is now only going to be able to prevent things that don't move means that there will be more turns to counterplay it afterward. That's the second thing. Move cards countering Professor X is like a legitimately pretty big deal. A card like Silk, for example, gains a lot of utility in a world where it can go into a Professor X lane. A card like Captain Marvel, for example, gains a lot of utility in a world where it can go into a Professor X lane. That's a really interesting way to try to take this card as a major dynamic in terms of deck building. Finally, the Hela point is, I think, very salient. I've seen a lot of pitches that involve Professor X becoming Spider-Man, but the one good thing Professor X does for this metagame is that he is unable to lose a lane against Hela effectively. He is one of the best ways to beat Hela. He is as powerful as it gets in terms of getting down before the card Hela comes down and dominating that matchup. He allows other decks to beat Hela. Now he will still maintain that ability because Hela cards won't be able to put in there. However, the most important part of this buff is that Cannonball PROF X is dead. Cannonball will now move the card you Cannonball into the PROF X lane unless it's filled up. This is a huge deal. It is the most important part of this. It relegates PROF X to, once again, being a combination with lesser versions of Cannonball. Other cards that just win a lane are going to be relevant. And I think that this is a very elegant solution to the problem that Professor X presented. Because, in order, the biggest problem with Professor X was PROF X Cannonball. The next biggest problem with Professor X was PROF X Ravonna. And the third biggest problem with Professor X was that it was hard to actually do anything meaningful to him that didn't make him a worse card in the Hela matchup. This solves all three of those issues. It is a great, great, great nerf. Ladies and gentlemen, we really got him. This is now a card that I do not know if it has a home. And I think, that was going to happen regardless with a nerf to PROF X of this nature. I honestly think that Cannonball did not lead to lose a point of power. And I think in the notes they actually talk about this. They basically say that they did not necessarily expect Cannonball to need to lose a point of power, but they wanted to make sure that this kind of stuff was not in the metagame anymore. And if he ends up becoming too bad, they will simply put the point of power back on. I appreciate that they are being explicit about that because I do think there are a lot of people that invested in this card under the promise, I would say, of Professor X Cannonball being like the best thing to do. So what is Cannonball in a world where Professor X doesn't exist? Well, the potential is that you can clog in different ways. So maybe this guy isn't actually dead. Maybe we are entering a magic Doc Ock Cannonball meta. Maybe that's fine. Maybe we're entering a full clog debris White Widow Cannonball meta. I think it is abundantly fair when you take all of this time and effort to set up your game-ending combo. The issue with PROF X Cannonball was, of course, play one card, play another one, win the game. That's very good, but it didn't require a lot of setup. You got to run it in a deck that just ran all the strongest threats anyway, and sort of got to free roll Professor X, making Cannonball roughly infinite power without actually paying a cost for it. in the deck building process. In order to make Cannonball work now, you have to pay a cost for it in the deck building process. You have to run clog cards, goblins, Doc Ock, make all that stuff work. You have to actually pay a cost. We have a chance to see if Cannonball is an actual problem. Because if he is an actual problem, that cost is going to be worth paying. If Professor X wasn't changed, this would be just as good as 5/8 Cannonball. It would be basically the same card. Professor X being changed to preclude what this card was doing with Prof X is notable. But if it turns out this card is as good as people say he is, and it wasn't just all Prof X, then we should be able to find ways to make this work. To me, this is one of the most interesting things that I'll be looking at over the course of the next few weeks. Is there going to be another Cannonball deck? I think about this sort of the same way I thought about Mockingbird after the Thanos nerf. Yes, that was the primary enabler. Yes, the other enablers are worse. Is there a way we can get back to not necessarily the glory days, but something still worth running? That, to me, is the question for Cannonball. Ladies and gentlemen, we got her. Hela is finally taking a nerf. I have said for a couple weeks now that I will not be happy with a Professor X nerf unless they also nerf Hela, because I think Professor X was really holding this deck back, and if he eventually falls off, which I would expect after this nerf, but I would not call guaranteed, then I would expect this deck to roar back in full force, except Second Dinner has hit it with a nerf that I think many people will look at and say, oh, this doesn't really matter, it's going to be fine. To me, I think this puts Hela in a very interesting range, because Hela right now is a deck that is predicated on creating the largest amount of points with the least amount of interaction, and in exchange for being a deck like that, it doesn't play any interaction of its own. So my question would be if it maintains that status. Is Bounce going to be able to go taller than Hela now? Who wins that heads up? Is a deck like Wong going to be able to go taller than Hela now? Because this is, to me, about a 6 or 8 power nerf to this deck. Like, on balance, you're bringing back 3 or 4 things, that's like -8 power. Is a deck that is wonging a bunch of white tigers going to be able to beat that? I think that's entirely possible now, and I think it's a little bit more in reach. It is very possible that this deck remains good and they have to change that number. But that's the other smart thing about this change, is it gives them a number on the card they can actually adjust. Hela's biggest issue, other than the fact that she's very hard to interact with, is that she's also very hard to balance. There aren't a lot of good ways to be like, I would like to tone Hela down a slight bit. Doing this, putting her at -2, means that you can say, okay, she's becoming incredibly problematic, let's go to -3, or okay, she's not as problematic as we expected, let's go to -1. This is a very sort of Galactus-y type card, and I'm interested to see how they end up dealing with this in the future. I'm not sure if -2 is the perfect spot. I think a lot will depend on the matchups that I talked about, where Hela is sort of predicated on going bigger than all the other decks that are playing things that can't really interact with it. There is a spot that other combo decks can take advantage of, and I'm interested to see if some of the pseudo combo decks like Wong Namora, like Bounce, can actually get up to the numbers that would make them beat this deck, which would sort of remove the main impetus for playing it. Red Hulk is eating another nerf, and I am eating crow. Like, this is now a card that's been nerfed twice. And granted, it's not like massive nerfs either time. He's going to 610, gain +3, which I think is fair. I think if I had to pinpoint one thing that I underestimated about Red Hulk, it's that of all the 6-drops, he's the best one to just have in your hand any given point, right? No other 6-drop spends the game accruing passive value, but effectively you get a Havoc proc's worth of value off of a Red Hulk, or now I should say a Athena proc's worth of value. Just by having it in your opening hand, it's a better card, and I think that sort of dynamic is behind a lot of its strength. Other 6-drops, you draw them in your opening hand, they're all downside. There's nothing you can do. This is the only 6-drop where you draw it in your opening hand and it's actually accruing value. And I think that is a real aspect of this card that was not necessarily taken into consideration when it was created. This card is now a questionably good card, because I think we're looking at like a 616 range. And that's exactly the range where it's like kind of on the edge. I still expect it to be a good card, but I would expect to see more Magnetos, more Doctor Dooms, more cards that maybe explore other aspects of being a 6-drop. And they mentioned in the notes that that's sort of the point of what they're doing here. Their goal here is not necessarily, oh, Red Hulk's overpowered. It's more like, oh, that's the best in slot 6-drop. Let's drop it down a little, see if we can create some more diversity at the top of the curve. I think that's an admirable goal because it's not like this card is actually going to be all that much worse. It's just going to be a little bit worse, right? Like 2-proc Red Hulk is effectively losing 1 power. 3-proc Red Hulk is effectively losing 2 power, and it doesn't really ever get that much bigger than that. So we're talking about a pretty minor nerf generally. I still think this is probably the best in slot 6-drop, but there are going to be other 6-drops that are more easy replacements now. And that's something I think is really important. As a content creator who does what I do, it is crucial that there are good replacements for cards. Previously, Red Hulk was so large that there really wasn't a great replacement. Now I think he'll be in a range where I can reasonably say, oh, yeah, just run Magneto, it'll be fine. My boy Gilgamesh getting a 2-power buff, which I think is pretty ambitious, honestly. That makes this guy like kind of a potential 520. That's a very big card. I do plan on experimenting with Gilgamesh Blue Marvel as my 5-drops of choice in pretty much whatever. Like, I feel like this is the kind of thing that I'll be playing instead of Professor X Cannonball because 520 is just a lot, right? Like, that is just a large amount of points. And at 5'9", all it needs to do is get like +5. And suddenly we're like in Red Hulk range, right? That's like 1-proc Red Hulk. Now that's bigger than 1-proc Red Hulk. It's 1 smaller than 2-proc Red Hulk. Like, this is a very large guy that is only balanced by the fact that it requires Blue Marvel to be good, but like, Blue Marvel's a pretty good card already, right? Like, this is a very compelling strategy to me right now. Like, I can't think of other cards that are as big as this. This is going to be Darkhawk sized, maybe? Like, and that's another card where it's like we have this thing that it's predicated on to get the power out of it. Although I do think I would likely say it's easier to get the thing Darkhawk is predicated on to happen. It's a little harder to counterplay against cards being added to your deck than it is to, say, have priority Enchantress the Blue Marvel. But by the same token, Blue Marvel is a better card than Korg Rockslide in terms of how much power it's adding to the board, because, like, you're talking about Blue Marvel, we're talking about Gilgamesh as, like, a potential 520. In the scenarios where Gilgamesh is a 520, Blue Marvel is, like, a 513 or 14, right? Like, this is a lot of power if you can fill the board up. A lot of power if you can fill the board up. And I don't know if you guys are aware of this, but points are really good in Marvel Snap. And the only question about this kind of deck is just fragility. Shaanna going to 3-4. Now, this is just kind of a crazy thing. Her whole journey, if I'm not mistaken, she released at 4-2, and now she's 3-4. This is a pretty cool card now, I gotta say. It's just like, there's some real inbuilt cost to playing any card that puts 2 things on a lane, one of which is a weak card, and then also puts stuff on the other lanes. I almost think this card would be better if it was just 3-4, create 2 squirrels. Because then you'd be able to, like, plausibly deck build around it, even though the power output would be lower, and also it wouldn't be double clogging the mid. I think Shaanna is a great example of just how hard it is to make a card that puts tokens on the board and make that card appealing. When you look at the versions of the token kind of cards that people play right now, Mysterio is being played because A, you know what all of them are, B, one of them is 4, C, discounts Mockingbird, and D, it clogs you less than Shaanna. And like, that I think is really key. That said, the stat line on this card is phenomenal now. Your average one drop is going to have a little bit under 2 power. This is like roughly a 310 right now. Like, that's a bunch of numbers. Is it enough numbers that you feel comfortable doing what you need to do to make this card good? I don't really know. The issue I think that this card will run into is there's a lot of powerful clog stuff in the metagame right now. Like, my video just yesterday was highlighting an Annihilus deck that had Debris. It had obviously the Annihilus package. It had, White Widow. And it's hard to rock up to a metagame like that and be like, yeah, I'm going to play Shaanna. That's what I'm going to do right now. But man, the numbers on this card are really good. Stegron, 4/7. Now it's going to move stuff to the right. I'm not going to lie to you. I'm very excited for this card for a couple of reasons. The first thing is 4/7 is a stat line that I feel like is just like good enough that you can think about playing this generically. And the second is knowing that you're going to move stuff to the right is like a very powerful clog kind of play to make. This card could create some real powerful things to happen when you are using it in concert with cards like Debris, cards that are also clogging your opponent like White Widow. You can force a lane closed fairly early. That's just a valuable ability, and now it's strapped on top of a 4/7 body, and that 4/7 body, like, that's a good body. That's a good body to have. And I think that I'm going to be at least considering this card at the 4-drop slot when I'm building most decks that involve it. And like, I'm already sort of theory crafting in my head, and I realize theory crafting is worth not very much, but here's my 2 cents. That might be all it's worth. Like a Miles Morales type clog deck. You know how I talked about like Cannonball and how it needed you to clog another lane now, and if you could accomplish that, you'd probably do a really good job at winning the game? This is a legitimate boost to whatever deck is trying to accomplish that. Whatever like Green Goblin, White Widow type deck, I think it could really want that and could also maybe work in a move package with Miles Morales. Maybe that's a little too far. Again, I don't really know. But I do think this is like a fairly compelling clog card now. And I'm weirdly interested in playing a card that I've never been interested in playing. Captain America is getting a 1-point buff. They noted in the notes that they were expecting the Spectrum deck to sort of stick around, and it just kind of didn't. So they wanted to give another point to Captain America to make sure he stuck around in that. I know there are going to be a couple people who are like, no, my Cerebro 2 deck, but I'm pretty sure, like, don't quote me on this, but I'm pretty sure he was bad in it. I get that it was a thing you could do, but I'm pretty sure it wasn't the best way to play Cerebro 2. But it was a way to play Cerebro 2, and that is now foreclosed to you. However, I do think that, maybe they could just put that point back on Spectrum, honestly. Like, I think that Spectrum losing that point is a little more impactful than Captain America gaining that. And when I think about that deck, the reason why is because Captain America fills a role that a lot of the other cards in that deck fill. It is your lane winner for your Jean Grey lane, right? But you already have Mojo, you already have US Agent filling that role. And so you end up in a spot where it's like, it's nice that Captain America does this, but what makes or breaks games is winning that other lane. And Spectrum is quite important to that. And I think losing that point on her was pretty harmful, and more harmful than making this card better at winning the lane you were already gonna win is going to be helpful. And so I don't expect this to necessarily do a lot for ongoing as a deck, but I am grateful that they're making Captain America better, right? We've all wanted Captain America to be better for a while now, and I think it's good that they found a way that doesn't like hugely imbalance the new player experience. So, yeah, more power to them. I'm happy for them. One thing I've been thinking about, and I realize this is like Omega Cope, but I am kind of interested in like playing at least Claw and maybe Claw Namor in these kind of decks because they're already so good at winning the lane that the Jean Grey goes in that it's like, how do I win any other lane? And so it's like, maybe like Claw into Spectrum will do it. I don't really know, but like it is definitely a thought I have had. I don't think this is what the deck needs, but it certainly won't hurt. And so I'm hopeful that people can start experimenting with that ongoing deck once again, thanks to this Captain America buff. And maybe we can get it on their radar that the point on Spectrum is a little bit more impactful than kind of anywhere else because of how the deck plays out. Finally, in what I would consider a fairly surprising move, the Ebony Blade created by Black Knight is losing his immunity to Shadow King. I don't know why I male gendered the Ebony Blade. It's losing its immunity to Shadow King. I'm pretty sure. Actually, for all I know, the Ebony Blade could be sentient and gendered. I don't know. I have never read anything featuring Black Knight. I have absolutely no idea. Let me know in the comments. Ebony Blade, the point is now only immune to Shang-Chi, no longer immune to Shang-Chi and Shadow King, and, you know, I don't necessarily think this was a balance change that was necessary because this was, like, so overpoweringly good or anything like that. I think it was just something they were like, yeah, I mean, long term, we should probably just do that anyway. Like, let's put in real counterplay. And I think that's important. I think that's a lesson they're learning. And they talked about this in the notes with Hela, where it's like, the issue with Hela, and I think the same issue applies to Ebony Blade, is not so much, oh, this is super powerful, but like, if it's happening to you, how do you deal with it? You want to be able to create a scenario where when this is happening to you, you're like, oh, I could have made a different decision in my deck, right? I could have played Shadow King. I could have done something. And both Hela and Ebony Blade did not really do that in a meaningful way. Like, that's not the only thing that, like, matters in terms of this, but, like, a lot of the time you'd run up against these cards and it was like, oh, I couldn't really have done anything about that. That's cool. I like that. That's a fun thing to do. And with Hela, it's more like also that, like, the things you could have done about that were just other stuff people hated. Like, what could I have done about losing to Hela? I could have put Professor X and Cannonball in my deck. We got him. That's kind of how, like, the Hela issue happens. I think this one's just a little bit more straightforward. There should probably be a way to deal with your unapproachably large guy, even if it's not super, like, imbalanced right now. I think if your card needs to read, can't be interacted with to be good, it probably shouldn't exist. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did. I am pretty happy. I'm not going to sit here and lie to you. They did everything I wanted. Like, this is everything I asked for. Nuke to PROF X. Mild tuned down to Cannonball, but the nuke to PROF X applies to him. Damage to Hela, so we don't immediately go back into a Hela meta, even though we could still. It could still be playable, which is, again, that's kind of a win, because Hela as a deck is a good budget deck, and I like when budget players are able to compete. I just hate that it's Hela. But that is beside the point. And, like, those are, like, the main headliners here for me. I think the rest of this is relatively marginal. If you are someone who purchased Red Hulk, I have one thing to say to you. After Red Hulk got nerfed the first time, a bunch of people showed up in my comments and they were like, KM, I can't believe that they bait and switched me. I spent 6,000 tokens on this card and they killed it. It's still so good. It just got nerfed again. Not one of you has apologized, and I demand apologies for that. So you hear me, random YouTube chatters? I demand apologies. I think history has absolved me on this one. Now, as far as my overall thoughts, yeah, I'm very happy. I enjoy this. What am I going to be doing on day one? I'm going to be trying Gilgamesh Blue Marvel. I'm going to be trying Cersei Annihilus mid-range. I'm going to be trying some typical, like, good cards into good 5-drops type decks. You know me. Maybe I'll play some Loki. Who knows? I don't know what's going to be good, but if I had to suggest areas to explore, I would say I would explore the Annihilus package. I would explore Doc Ock Cannonball decks, or, like, Clog Cannonball decks. I would explore maybe something along the lines of the Gilgamesh Blue Marvel deck, although I'm not sure. It's going to be a real competition between, like, what I would call the Gilgamesh package and the Annihilus package for supremacy in that spot. And finally, what I would look at is there a way to make PROF X good again? Like, is there a way to make this card good, even though people can move stuff into it? Maybe. There might legitimately be. And I think that one of the things that I've learned recently is To quote Yasuo, what is it? The unseen blade is the deadliest. I don't know if that's Yasuo, actually. I hope I'm right. The point is, the unseen blade is the deadliest. When people aren't prepared for something, that's the best time to play it. And I gotta imagine not a lot of people are gonna be prepared for Le Professeur coming out right now. So I am interested to see what he can do. He has traditionally been a very powerful card, and I think it's possible that he ends up not so powerful, but there's now a deck, an archetype. The whole Ravonna archetype is now in need of a new endgame. I'm going to be trying Blue Marvel there, obviously. And I am interested to see what that end game goes on to do. So let me know what you're going to be trying on day one. I've been KM Best. You have been phenomenal, and I'll see you in the next one.